All right. So I'm really excited. I'm going to tell you all, Melissa is one of my favorite speakers. So this is kind of fun because, I get to see one of my favorite speakers. Not that everybody hasn't been fantastic, but Melissa's super cool. So I'm so excited to introduce Melissa Tondi to everybody. Melissa is great, and I'm very, very excited to get to talk to you again. It's been, I think, since San Francisco, so
I think
2019.
so, yes. Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And I believe your talk is automation, we're doing it wrong.
That is correct.
Awesome.
I always like to put a little bit of a controversial, title in there on my slides sometimes, you know?
Nice. Melissa,
So,
you might want to swap your screens.
okay, I will do that.
Okay.
Let me and I am let's see here. If I share just make sure.
That or put it in present mode. Maybe it's not in.
Yeah, maybe it's let's see here. Can you see
There
that?
we go.
Okay.
Much better.
Excellent. Okay.
Awesome.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks again. I'm excited to kind of share some of my thoughts here, and hopefully, you'll be able to take a couple of nuggets back from just your overall test automation strategy. So this is kind of why we titled this "Automation: We're Doing It Wrong." So here's some of the high level areas that we're going to touch here in our short amount of time together here. Specifically, we're talking about not only what test automation is and making sure that we're all kind of level set on using terminology and kind of making sure that we are all aligned with what test automation is, but a lot of times it's even equally or and sometimes even more important to specify what test automation is not. So we're going to talk a little bit about that again so we can level set ourselves, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the misconceptions and misperceptions on what automation is. So when we're talking from our technical leadership or folks that have very strong opinions, whether right or wrong, on what test automation is and should be, we're going to give a little bit of just pointers and areas that you can kind of bolster up your messaging when you are either pushing over an enterprise wide test automation strategy, or if you are an individual contributor, an automation engineer or quality engineer who practices test automation within your own squads or project teams. We're going to give you a little bit of information there. And then we're going to talk about those misconceptions and misperceptions and how to actually address those, AKA the hits, when we talk about the misses and the hits. And then if we've got time, we'll talk and field some questions. So we'll jump right into it. Again, I don't really need to go through here. This is a little bit of my background here. If you've heard me speak before, I love kind of sharing my thoughts into the greater community, but more importantly, I love getting others' thoughts and recommendations in the community. So if you are a speaker, or are maybe dabbling your toe into the world of speaking, it goes both ways there. You can contribute to the community, but you can also consume from the community. And I feel very fortunate to have been able to do both in my career. And now, since I'm sharing back to the community, I also want you to be able to share your insight and feedback here. So we'll jump right into it. I came up with this quote: test automation makes humans more efficient, not less essential. And that quote really kind of framed many years ago when we were talking about why are we doing test automation. There was a time when we had lots of expensive costs on big, huge commercial tools where we had to justify the huge expense of a commercial tool, and so we invested in hiring automation engineers that were very specialized and skilled within those tools that we, as in quality engineering or quality assurance leadership, put in place within our strategies and that or within our teams and departments. And that was very, very big and common, and is still very big and common now. But now, with of course the onset of many open source tools, where we're kind of giving back the power to the individuals with test automation, we wound up coming up with lots and lots of individual solutions for test automation at the individual level. And what we noticed and realized is that we didn't really have a well baked out and consistent overarching enterprise-wide test automation strategy. So when we had that onset of kind of big commercial tools that became the silver bullet for automation testing, again, we hired automation engineers with skill sets around those tools. So in counterbalance to that, when we realize there's not necessarily a better way to do it, but a different way to approach test automation, we came up with this quote that I just read a little bit earlier. So in addition to that, we should always kind of form any tool and technology that humans adopt and embrace should be in order to make more repetitive and more manual types of activities much more efficient. And so we always elevate the human interaction with the software as much more important for the feedback and the information gathering. And that's where that user advocacy piece comes into play. So when we think about test automation, we really should be using this quote to kind of guide the overall goal and outcome of that. So, and as I mentioned earlier, we can't talk about what automation is without really addressing what it isn't or what it should not be. So it's not that silver bullet. Again, investing in tools and technology, especially large enterprise-wide commercial-based tools, there's a ton of benefit to the outcome of what we're going to be doing, but it should not be necessarily treated as a silver bullet. It's not going to immediately increase productivity. But if the strategy is created and approached correctly, it should or will allow the teams to fail often and quickly. And that term, fail often and quickly, is really what not only test automation allows us to do much quicker, but it also contains those failures in a way that we reduce the risk of those failures. I am of the mindset that we should be failing often and quickly, so that we do accept that instant feedback of those failures, and we should be able to address those failures so that when we are ready to go live, so to speak, or deploy out, whether that's multiple times a day or quarterly releases, whatever that looks like in your organization, that fail early, fail often is one of the key components and outcomes that a good test automation strategy allows you to do. Um, the other thing that I want to point out is that test automation is not necessarily a comprehensive testing activity. It's one activity in the overall strategy, and then of course that last bullet point here, it's not necessarily testing. And I'm not going to open the debate in because I know that there are lots and lots of different opinions on whether or not test automation is testing. We think testers are testing. The embracing and adoption of tools and technology should allow for the human interaction, that tester or quality engineer advocating for the users who will eventually be consuming and using the solutions that we deliver to them. So let's talk about what it's not, and we'll kind of start talking about the misses, specifically on test automation. So it shouldn't be, or it's not, the numbers or percentage game. And what I mean by that is, if we achieve a certain percentage or number of test cases that already exist. So thinking about how we generally approach testing is that we will create tests, and usually, if they're not going to be automated at moment, we throw them into a test case management repository. Those test cases are generally executed by human testers or humans throughout a cycle. And then at some point in time, those test cases that had already been executed by that tester becomes automated, right? And so we kind of, we prioritize those tests. And then at some point in time, there is a measurement or a number that we say, well, how many of our test cases or what percentage of our test cases have been automated? And then that in and of itself, the higher the number, if we're in the 80s or 90%, then that somehow means that we have a higher quality of the product that we're delivering, right? And so for those of you who have been in this misses specifically, you know that that's certainly not a measure of quality. It's a number that anyone can actually report on, right? So we want to get out of the game of using a number or percentage of automated test cases to somehow be correlated to the quality or higher quality of the product. Um, so in a lot of cases, sometimes, there's not necessarily nowadays to a need to have a separate matrixed team that handles all of the test automation, and that's somehow look, in a lot of cases it may look very much like, the same scenario that I just described earlier, which is I am a tester. I may be a manual tester, so to speak. I write test cases, and then further down the road I mark which test cases I want automated in the future, and then it kind of goes off into a separate team, and then at some point in time some time passes, and then those test cases have magically been automated, and that code may have been released out to production sometimes days, weeks, or sometimes months after the actual automation of those tests come into place, right? So and then a lot of times, because we, require specific skill set and technical experience in order to be able to test automate, whether we're using a commercial tool or not. There is sometimes we have that this role of this automation engineer is more pedestaled, right? So where it's perceived or viewed as a more important role within the team because this particular role has more technical skills, right? And so when we get into the game of who is more valuable on the team, sometimes that automation engineer wins in that case because the technical skills are more valued in some companies than the overarching quality engineering or testing skills. So, and then another way that you may think about this, or that you may be experiencing, is that there is a need for a separate team, that they're matrix, and so that we have to maintain that kind of third party watchdog, so to speak, to make sure that those test cases are written correctly in order for that automation engineer who may not have much understanding of what they're actually testing. If we only have their responsibility is to simply automate tests that have already been written by someone further up the further left of them, then we actually remove the ability for that automation engineer to be able to interact with the software much like a user. So we're very much in this case, we're very much pigeonholing that automation engineer to only do a certain function, and we're not relying on the human component of that automation engineer to actually give good feedback on the software or solution that they are responsible for automating within those tests. Another miss is that assuming that the QE or the automation engineer owns all of the automation. And we also kind of call this the silo effect. And then that person is the only one that decides what gets automated, right? So again, we are we're offering the option of saying, look, if you have a matrix team that their only responsibility is to automate, then if they're not embedded or they are siloed in this way, then we're really missing a huge opportunity to get their feedback on the actual quality or the look and feel, or the feeling of the software, in order to have not only high quality functioning software, but high quality, delightful software that our users enjoy using, in addition to actually getting what the software is supposed to be doing done in their own day to day. So another one of the misses is this middleman strategy, and I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier. And by the way, I kind of put in here, I know that we use the term manual a lot, and I certainly still use it. I just can't stand using that terminology. I think we need to come up as an industry just a better way to differentiate between test automation and testing, right? So anyway, for lack of a better term at this point, we will continue to use the manual piece of that. But more importantly, when we have this middleman strategy, and again, this looks like what I kind of previously talked about. We have a tester that is embedded, or testers that are embedded within their project or delivery team, their agile team, squad, whatever your terminology you use. And then some point in time, we check those test cases off, and then somebody not embedded within the team comes back later, or maybe at the end on a 12-hour cycle. We may hand those off to an offshore or near shore team, and then magically those tests begin getting automated without having that person that's actually automating those tests embed within the team and get all of that great knowledge that should be or is being shared within each of those daily kind of interactions that are happening within the project or delivery team. So we want to make sure that we avoid that middleman strategy. Um, and then, of course, the bigger one, and this kind of goes back to that quote that I had mentioned before. It is certainly not the replacements of humans, but in some cases, if we do wind up having a very robust and comprehensive test automation strategy in place and actually executing on, there may be a change in responsibilities in the quality engineering team, just based off of the number of tests that become automated. But if there's ever a component or an outcome to say X number of tests that are automated equals X number of testers that we no longer need within our organization, we already know that that's probably one of the biggest misses of all when we think about overarching enterprise wide strategy around test automation. Um, I ran into this. This was part of my own journey of kind of in my one of my first forays of QE management several years ago, where there was a mandate from our CTO that all quality engineers or QA or testers must become experts in test automation. And me being a very junior or very novice manager, I took that without any kind of conversation, and I took that mandate and I tried to implement it. And let me tell you, it was a disaster. I lost probably some of the best testers because of that mandate, and that was a major huge learning opportunity that learned from we failed with that implementation and we learned better. And I will take that lesson with me from for the last 10 years when I first learned that lesson. But the point here is that we must be able to not only have the equity around our team and not pedestal somebody that has more technical skills than another one and perceive that the more technical one is, the better the comprehensive or overall testing they would be able to actually produce within a strategy. So the idea here is that we should not necessarily mandate. Mandates are one of the surefire ways to have a lot of attrition in your team or your organization. But specifically for us as quality engineers, if there is any hesitancy for us taking up test automation in any capacity, it boils down to we are a technologist. Just the fact that what we do on our day to day. If we're not considered technologists, we certainly should be considered technologists. And one call to action that I would ask for you is that you do consider yourself a technologist. And with that said, taking your own technical development into your own hands and driving that on your own, and hopefully in conjunction and collaboration with your company who should be supporting that, we want to make sure that we understand that the test automation is not a replacement, and should not be a replacement of humans themselves. So let's talk about the hits that come about this. So we talked about the misses, and now we're going to talk a little bit about how do we address those misses that have propagated for in some cases many years and likely still exist within a lot of companies and organizations. So the percentage number, right? So instead of saying an X number of test cases have been automated or X number percentage of those have been automated, we're going to automate the right tests. And then we use the A of A measure, or what we call automated of automatable, to actually report on that. So, what do I mean by automated of automatable? With a good test automation strategy, sometimes there are guidelines that we put in place. So, for example, one of the test automation strategies that we initially start out is we start basic building blocks. So I think if I say a smoke test, that should resonate with most of you. Smoke test, basic, building block or very basic, critical functionality of a test. We further define that by saying a smoke test should actually consist of the CRUD actions that result within a story. And so what we start doing is we actually start focusing on the basic building blocks of the test automation first, and we embed that person who has that test automation experience within the project team, so that we no longer have that middleman process, but that we are measuring something, not only the number, and we don't actually, in our organization anyway, we do not report on, nor do we see value in a percentage or number of test cases that have been automatable. What we have seen much more successes on is to measure and report on the number of automated tests that can be or should be automated, given that priority scale that I'll kind of go in a little bit of a detail in just a little in just a few minutes. So how do we address the separate role or the title as a long-term strategy, right? So how do we address the fact that we don't have an embedded automation engineer, so to speak, that is part of an existing squad or delivery team? So if you have a huge backlog of test automation that needs to continue to be, perfect example for when contractors or consultants is able to jumpstart that work, right? A lot of times, it's daunting to see how much needs to be automated, but this is a great this is one of the great ways to kind of justify bringing in a team who specializes in that to kind of get through that enormous backlog of work, while the testers are actually continuing to test the software. When we mandate this number or percentage of automated tests, we feel the need in this case to bolster up the test automation team, but we wind up overloading them again, which is why that number or percentages game is a very slippery slope. And I would recommend not using that as the number one, or really even a valuable or important metric to measure on. First, I would rather say use that A of A in this situation. And again, I talked a little bit about this third bullet point, where a lot of cases that we have this pedestaled role of an automation engineer, where there is a perception that their skills are more valuable than someone who can actually test and advocate for our users. So in our world, and I'll kind of show this in here because you may be thinking, well, what does this mean? What does this slide mean? So how does it look like in our world? How do we ensure that there is a good path for promotion within, and how does this look like when we start forming teams? So this is a very typical slide that I've used, and from company to company or consulting to consulting, I tend to, oops, excuse me. I tend to look at this. If we don't have a way for our quality engineers to promote into the technical path, this is a really nice snapshot of what a good, well thought out, and mature quality engineering organization looks like. So we start elevating those, or we start actually mapping out those more technical team components when we move into the architect and principal mode. But we clearly have a path for engineers to move into both into a management or into a technical path. And so I've been asked many times of how I structure my team, and this is what this is what we generally look like from team to team. So, how do we address the myths around the separate team that is matrixed, right? We start embedding them and having them in our planning and refinement and grooming sessions. We embed them. So, ideally, when we have a path, whenever testing is ready to start, ideally, the testing activities that we would start right during or right after those refinement or grooming is we actually start creating those tests. And again, in a more traditional role, those tests would start being created by that quote unquote manual tester, and then come back around later down the cycle and then have those tests automated, right? So we want to remove that inefficient practice, and we want to actually embed that quality engineer with test automation experience within the project or the agile team. We include them in planning. And so what winds up happening is that we have an umbrella of all testing activities to include test creation, and whether that is a test that is going to be executed or run by a tester, the human, and or a test that is automated and will be run by within the framework that'll be executed. But the idea is that those are both tests, and those tests are both written as soon as the all of the testing activities happen. So we start creating collaboration between the tester who may not have test automation experience or deep technical skills to be able to support test automation. We begin pairing and collaborating both of those roles within each other, within the project team itself. Um, we have that clear strategy and the definitions, and ideally we are aligning with the industry, and for because I inevitably get asked this question as well. One of the best things that we've adopted, and I've adopted the Istqb glossary. And again, I know there's a lot of debate and back and forth on Istqb certifications or any certifications in there. One of the best things that has come out of the Istqb board is the glossary. And I have been using that glossary for at least 12, maybe even 15 years now. I take that glossary and introduce it to every team, because what I have experienced is that one of the biggest hurdles to cross is actually is level setting terminology that is in use in an organization. So when we have that clear strategy and definitions, and we align the strategy and definitions with other industry, within our quality engineering or QA industry, and with other leaders that are doing this across the globe, we know that we have a good standard and building block to build off of. Now, I'm not saying that we need to, now conform or adhere to only the Istqb or only the industry, but the alignment and specifically around the terminology that we use to describe what we're doing is super valuable. So if you're not currently using a glossary that is in place in your organization, and you find that you are using terminology differently, and you've gotten to the point where one person has interpreted a term differently than you and creates a solution based off of their interpretation, some of the challenges and pain points that winds up introducing. So if you don't have a clear glossary, and if you don't already have those definitions defined well enough that everyone in your organization is using those, I would certainly recommend using the Istqb glossary for that purpose. So how do we address the myths of, that the QE or the automation engineer owns all the automation? So this is kind of where we put together our 1 to 3 priority. So the very first thing that we should be considering for automation is what's happening traditionally to the left of us. What are our developers or software engineer counterparts doing on their end from their own automation? The ISTQB kind of defines this as an intake test, and it really is. It's really kind of a combination of unit and integration tests. So one of the first pieces of automation that we should be considering, even though we don't traditionally own that, is the intake test or that automated unit and or integration tests that are coming from our dev team. So in that, if that's not in place, or you're not sure whether or not is in place, that would be one of the first conversations that I would recommend you have after this great conference, is to start understanding what type of testing and or automation is happening within your software engineer or development counterparts. Um, the next priority that we start doing, and this kind of now moves to the right more towards where the quality engineer that's automating, or that has that automation experience, starts looking at that smoke test, right? And so I've included the ISTQB definition of a smoke test, and we've further defined that by CRUD action: create, read, update, delete. If any of that story or any of those acceptance criteria that's part of that story has any of those 4 actions, create, read, update, delete, as part of its functionality or solution, then that begins the very first piece of automation that we start building out. So again, that should be equivalent to a very basic building block there. What this does is it also starts corroborating with the success of that user story. And as we all know, acceptance criteria is what our product owners or product managers use to accept the work as successful. And to even put a finer point on that, if you were to gather all of the acceptance criteria and all of the user stories that had been worked on in a set amount of time, those that acceptance criteria equals the MVP, or the minimum viable product, or sometimes called minimum MMP, minimum marketable product. And that in and of itself is the definition of what success looks like for this team to delivery. So if we're not tying our test automation to what the overall success is for that delivery team to deliver whatever their cycle of work is, whether it's daily, every 2 weeks, or whatever your deployment frequency is, that's one of the biggest reasons why test automation at the enterprise wide level fails. We don't see, or our counterparts in product and in development don't see the value of automation because it's not necessarily tied to the critical functioning components of that software that we're building. So we recommend that that smoke test not only adhere to our Istqb definition, but we also tie that to the excuse me, the user advocacy, which then tends to tie into the acceptance criteria of that work. So you can see that we've kind of detailed out the priority one of those tests that should be automated, are those intake tests that, again, traditionally belong to dev. The next priority then starts building that basic building block of the smoke test. And then that priority three then is tied to the user advocacy, the end to end flows, anything that would cause a priority one, severity one issue when we release that code into production, and that we are very much correlated and lockstep within our product and business counterparts and partners within there to show them. So, this is one of those areas where we can start forging and continuing to foster great relationships outside of just the engineering team, which is generally where we tend to stay. So how do we address the myths of using the middleman strategy, right? So again, talked a little bit about that, what that means. So this is kind of a nice guide here, you know, of how we avoid that. So we tie and we embed folks that have test automation, and we kind of hire quality engineers with specific skill sets around there. So in our organization, we have quality engineers with test automation experience. We also have quality engineers with performance testing experience, or accessibility experience, or domain knowledge experience. So when we staff teams, if there is a need, or a great need for test automation, we embed that quality engineer within that team with the expectation that all quality engineers are capable to define and create a test strategy that includes both automation and non-automation of tests, and that overarching quality component in there. We do not separate the role of an automation engineer and remove that quality engineering or test strategy from their sphere of responsibilities. So this is kind of what it looks like here. We put a little bit more definition around what it means to automate something. We actually say that it has to be run in the pipeline. It's kicking off if we have a mature DevOps model and how we deploy code. We tie our test automation to the deployment of that code, and most importantly, we tie the automation of that priority one, which is the unit and integration test, or the intake test, and the priority two, which is the automated smoke test, as in our definition of done. We do not consider a story done unless we have both of those two components automated. And then we come back around with that P3 kind of and dealer's choice afterwards. But we actually don't ship code, or we should not be shipping, or excuse me, we should not be shipping or considering stories complete without having those P1 and P2 automation in there. How do we address the myths of the replacement of humans again? I this is just such a theme that we talk about in almost all of my talks, certainly. But again, we look at the fact that it is not the replacement of the humans. We actually want our humans, the people that we are employing, to be as interactive with the software as much as possible. Because the first one of the biggest values that we bring back to our project team or delivery team is the fact that we can advocate for our users. We should and can and must always be advocating for our users. And the best way for us to do that is to actually interact with the software like they're interacting with the software. And sometimes, more importantly, like how they may interact with the software, right? And so the more we can continue to explore the software, and the more time we save by actually adopting a more defined enterprise wide test automation strategy, allows that human to interact with the software more and more and more. So, here's the summary. So when we think about why we are doing the things the wrong way in test automation, we have these misses: the numbers game, the pedestal effect, that QE is the only one that owns automation, the middleman strategy, and the perception that an automation somehow replacement replaces humans, and this fallacy that a quality engineer or tester is not a technologist. Those are the misses. Those have generally been some of those wide components and characteristics that have created failed or not as successful test automation strategies at the enterprise wide level. And by enterprise, it really is two or more teams, right? So I kind of use the term enterprise. It really is a scalable approach, whether we have two project teams or if we have 200 project teams. I mean, we address those by using the column on the right. We address the numbers game by using a much better and more concise metric of the A of A, the automated of automatable. If we say that we have this clear priority 1 through 3, how well are we delivering and how well can we actually measure the automation of how we clearly defined it? We embed and we envelop. We certainly embed anyone that has any responsibility to complete a story, and whether they are or are not embedded within the project or delivery team, we embed them as much as we possibly can, and we avoid the matrix teams that become the pedestal teams. We use this P1 through P3, and we involve all of our other partners that represent our SDLC and delivery team. Um, and then we just create this efficient selection category. If this happens, then we do this. And most importantly, we continue to push this and drive out the misperception that somehow test automation is a replacement of humans. So, with that said, here is my contact information. I'll kind of leave this slide up for a little bit, and I will kind of go back to Jenna and see if there are any questions or any comments on the talk here. All right.
Okay. That was fantastic. I really, really connected with this idea of like the hierarchy and the pedestal because you see it a lot, especially at the enterprise level. There's some misconceptions about what technical is and who can be technical and who adds value and who doesn't. So I really, really connected with that. Mark a couple of times chimed in and said that he's a big fan of low maintenance, most repeated for automation.
Yeah.
Um, and I really love that he pointed out about making sure that you provide what your particular audience needs. Because some audiences, he's right, are really going to like love getting the results. But I feel like everybody does when they know what to do with them or when they know how to use them. Um, so
Agreed, and thanks, Mark. Of course, Mark is chiming in with the awesome comments as he always does. Hi, Mark. It's one thing I've kind of been, and this is not a new term, but I'm kind of repurposing the term slightly as I tend to do. But tests as a service as opposed to testing as a service. So our role right now, or one of our outcomes for our test automation is, so it's great. We have all these great automated tests, and they're giving us the right kind of, the output, which is exactly what we should be doing. But more importantly, what tends to happen with that is that we tend to have like one Slack channel where those tests are coming in, and like one or two people are, oh, I'm on the schedule for Tuesday. I'm the one that's on the hook to go through all the failures, or like go through. It's an hour and a half of the first thing in the morning, right? And so we're like 75% there, but we still have those results coming to a very small or select group of people, and that generally comes to the testing team, or the folks that have responsible for automating those tests to begin with. I'm a fan of tests as a service, where one of the other kind of red bows to complete test automation, not only tying it to shippable or the definition of done, but also to say, and anyone on the team has access to run this suite of tests, should be running this suite of tests, and it should be organized so that the main people that would be running those tests would be the developers, right? So if you start creating these suites of tests that are organized the way that the developers organize their code, and how they are organized and kind of assigned or staffed to a team, you're going to get so much more buy-in to say, okay, if you're touching this code, here are the suites here, or the suite of automated tests and where it belongs. And when you're ready to go, run this locally, or also run this right before your merge, right? So now we're actually pushing out that test so that anyone and everyone can and should be running those, as opposed to having it only be the tester, the automation engineer, or the quality engineer pushing the button, right? So we're kind of maturing that approach of tests as a service, and again, as opposed to testing as a service, which has a very different meaning. So that's one of those. And again, kind of tying those, one of the biggest things is that, it's sometimes, if you don't have buy-in from your product counterparts on, well, why is automation important, when you start tying those to the acceptance criteria, every product manager in the world is going to be very, very keen on ensuring that their AC that was successfully delivered, is going to stay in that state until they make the decision to change it otherwise, right? And so by tying that test automation to that, everyone gets that information, and it's going to be very much in front of everyone, so that we see just the health of that product, and tying it to the AC, which eventually ties it to the MVP or MMP of that product line.
And it also draws that clear distinction between TDD and what
Yeah.
automation actually delivers. Because
Yes.
TDD is really about compliance. This
Yes.
is not about whether something actually works. It's not about whether it solves the problem. It's about, did we code this the way we said we were going to code it? Does this functionally actually compile and run? But
Absolutely.
we can build things, build TDD tests, and have made completely wrong assumptions, and so delivered the wrong thing entirely. So it's that really important distinction that sometimes developers have a hard time seeing.
Yeah, I
'Cause
agree. And and one other thing that we've seen success with is, if we start tying the automation of the AC is like one of those highest priority things to
Mhm,
automate outside of the unit and integration. And I cannot stress
mhm,
that enough. Like, we must have that understanding of what is happening to the left of us, so that we avoid this black hole of, I have no idea what our unit and integration status is, or what our
mhm,
guidelines are. So I'm going to assume that there's nothing being done, and we wind up overinflating what we test because we don't have the visibility, or that's not being shared with us, right? So I stress that very first priority of automation should certainly belong within that unit and integration test. And then that second one is more tied to the AC. When you start tying that to the AC, then it actually also has the secondary good outcome of making sure that the AC is very well understood, and that everybody is aligned with that AC, to have that extra point of, and can it be automated, right? And so when you simply ask that question of, can this AC be automated? That causes all sorts of great discussions, which then ultimately impact the overall quality of the software. So I think that there's several secondary and tertiary outcomes, successes with simply tying things like those requirements around automation within the definition of done and shippable.
I completely agree. Melissa, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I always love getting to see you and getting to chat with you.
And
Really and truly
likewise.
one of my favorites.